We're back. Week 3 is over, so now it's week 4. Penn State's coming off a 28-3 victory over Rutgers this past weekend. The stripe out worked, which in its own right was fairly incredible because they didn't hand in any shirts. They just told everybody what to wear, and they did it. And it's hard to get 100,000, 103,000 people to do anything together, let alone organized like that. So that was impressive, but probably more importantly for Penn State fans, Penn State's offense looked as functional as it has all year.
Yes.
It wasn't great, it wasn't perfect, but it helps when you can get over 300 yards rushing. It helps when you don't have to make a passing game that hasn't really looked good be the focal point of the offense. So I think all of those things, for as many odd moments and maybe little mental, as Jason Kambinis called them, brain farts that happened over the course of that game. I think the fact that Penn State came out and beat a team it should have beaten and looked decent doing it is probably the biggest takeaway from a week like that. I don't know what you saw out in the rain yet again this past weekend.
Yes, the pouring rain, which came an hour earlier than it was forecasted to, unfortunately. But what our own Mike Poorman wrote about the Monday after the game was whether Christian Hackenberg is becoming more of a game manager of a quarterback than the gunslinger that he had been, especially in his freshman year and somewhat last year as well. And whether or not that's a good thing for Penn State if that is the case. It certainly looked that way. He's throwing a lot of short passes, a lot of checkdowns, a lot of screens, as opposed to a lot of long balls down the field, with the exception of a couple. There was a good ball to Chris Godwin early in the first half. And it looked that way. He, on the season, is completing 50% of his passes. He completed 50% of his passes the other day. He isn't picking up a lot of yards per attempt. He isn't throwing a lot of balls deep downfield. And, maybe this is going to be an offense that, despite what it might have looked like, it would have been a couple of years ago at this point. I think if you look back 2 years ago, people probably would have projected that Christian Hackenberg is throwing for 300 yards a game every game in his junior year. But maybe this is an offense that's centered around the run, focused on the run, and uses the pass game more sparingly than it had previously.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to Penn State's coaching staff has to make some decisions in terms of, these are the things that we're able to do as an offense. These are the things we'd like to be able to do as an offense. And these are the things that we're going to be successful at. And I think everyone wants to see an offense where Penn State throws for 400 yards and Christian Hackenberg looks like the sort of quarterback that everyone thinks that he is. But realistically, with the offensive line that they have, with some of the issues that the receivers have had getting open, it's really not reasonable to expect Christian Hackenberg to drop back, 5-step drop out of the shotgun, just sling it around, because they just can't do it. So Penn State has to go, and John Donovan has to go, well, what can we do? Well, sometimes we can move the pocket. Sometimes we can throw screens. But really, the thing that they've shown, at least this past week, that they're really able to do is run the ball. And that requires Hackenberg to be a guy who, if he's in a pass play and sees a situation like Akil Lynch's 75-yard touchdown run, it is something that they check into. One of the longer passes to Deshaun Hamilton is something that they check into. So you go, we need you to manage the game, we need you to manage the offense. And maybe that doesn't utilize Hackenberg's talents in the most flashy of ways, but it does utilize his mind, which is one of his strongest assets, and it does utilize the fact that Penn State's doing things that it can do. And I think it's probably a difficult pill for that coaching staff to swallow, to have a potential first-round draft pick under center, who's actually under center now, and not use him in a way that looks like an NFL quarterback. But as long as Penn State's moving the ball and scoring points, considering where they started in week 1, it's hard to complain or say that they haven't made progress in that area.
When you talk about Christian Hackenberg taking snaps under center this week, I think that's something that's benefited the run game as well. They tried a lot of runs out of the shotgun, a lot in the first week against Temple, a few less in the second week against Buffalo, but they're getting the running backs to take carries with some momentum, running snaps out of the center this past week, and I think that's been a benefit. It gives them there's certainly an advantage when you have some more speed when you're taking the ball as opposed to when you're taking it out of the shotgun for a running back, and you saw that to the effect of 195 yards and 2 scores for Barkley and 100 and change and a touchdown for Akeel Lynch. So the run game seemed to benefit from some changes that were made. And
it just comes back to the balance that you always want. I mean, when you can pass it, it opens up the run game. When you can run, it opens up the pass game. So it's actually interesting because James Franklin, someone asked him about play calling balance, and he says, well, you like to try and get it, balanced in a numerical sense, 50-50 or what have you. And Bill O'Brien used to say that, having a balanced offense is being able to run the ball when you have to and being able to throw it when you have to. And they coached under very different times, but it's sort of an interesting dynamic to see how they approach what does a balanced offense actually mean. But I think, at the end of the day, they're scoring points, they're moving the ball, and that's all anybody's really looking for.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the numbers, it wasn't balanced in terms of yardage. The vast majority of the yardage came by the run as opposed to through the air. But at the same time, that sort of Bill O'Brien mantra that you just recited, they could pass the ball when they needed to on Saturday, and they ran the ball well when they needed to on Saturday. So if that's your definition of a balanced offense, they certainly fit the bill on Saturday.
Transitioning away from Rutgers, Penn State plays San Diego State this weekend. It's made for kind of a weird week from the news side because it's not a big game in the eyes of a lot of fans. There hasn't been a lot of news, but it's still an opportunity for Penn State to go out, pick up a win against a team that was in a bowl last year, against a team that's traveled a lot but doesn't seem to be affected by that. San Diego State's a team that comes in with one win. They got their week 1 win over San Diego, lost to Cal, then lost last week to South Alabama, which is a pretty tough way to keep your season going, to lose to an FCS school. A very short aside, I finally accomplished one of my life goals, which is to take South Alabama, one of the worst teams in the NCAA video game, and I beat Alabama with them. So now I can retire. I've done everything.
In Heisman mode.
In Heisman mode. So life is essentially, I've basically done everything I set out to, when I started this whole journey.
Yeah, I'm
many years
really,
ago.
I'm proud and happy for you.
It made me happy. But nevertheless, San Diego State comes in with a defense that will give you a lot of different looks. James Franklin mentioned yesterday after practice that they like to bring 2 different blitzes that a team has never seen before each week, something different. Something that you won't see on film when you try and prep to go into that game. That can lead to some problems, but ultimately there's only so many blitzes, there's only so many ways to cover them, so it's just a matter of sort of finding that balance between not overthinking things and keeping an eye out for something that you haven't seen.
As a Jets fan, I, for 5 or 6 years, heard the term exotic blitz packages thrown around way more often than I'd ever like to hear that term in my life. And in the end, you can use the phrase exotic blitz packages all you like, but in the end, you're sending 6, 7 guys, and you have 6 guys on the line to block them, and it really is in the end as simple as that. There's only
so many ways to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, exotic sounds a little fancier than it actually is in practice.
They're gonna be very fancy. They're gonna blitz with a French accent.
Yes.
It's just going to be a very exotic blitz. You'll hear them in the cadence in Spanish and Portuguese. Nevertheless, I think ultimately this game is the sort of thing where Penn State can continue to make the little steps forward that it has to on offense. You don't really get the impression that San Diego State's offense is going to give Penn State's defense any trouble. So this game comes down to getting reps, making progress. Can you get Saquon Barkley more carries? Can you get the offensive line more confidence? Maybe can you get Hackenberg working down the field a little bit more before they start to really get into the meat of the schedule coming up here? So there's not a lot to go over with San Diego State. That's not to take anything away from the fact that they try very hard and their parents love them and all of those sorts of things. But it's just not. It doesn't bring the same air as last week when you played
the
Rutgers.
Same cachet,
yes.
if you will.
Yes. So it's pretty straightforward. I do think on the flip side of all of that, it's one of those games where it's important that Penn State comes out not flat, because you don't want to come out of an emotional weekend. You beat Rutgers, you go into practice, and you show up against a team where you feel like you ought to beat them, and it ought to be pretty easy, and you find yourself in a game that you should have never been in the first place. The impression that I get is James Franklin teams don't really have that problem. They're all pretty high energy. The fact they practice on Sunday to sort of focus on the next week coming up sort of flushes everything out. And I think the fact that Penn State won the game against Rutgers fairly easily avoids a lot of that sort of big game emotion of, oh, we won on a last-second kick, or we lost on a last-second kick. When the game's more or less decided by midway through the third quarter, you can kind of mentally disengage yourself from all of that. So that's really, I think Penn State wins pretty comfortably. The line in Vegas opened at 9 points, and I think it's gone up to 12, and I haven't looked in a few days, and I imagine it's gone from there. So for the first time, probably all season, Penn State's got a game that it can win by a lot of points and probably can do that. So before we go, I have to get to Twitter questions, because that's everybody's favorite part. Or it's my favorite part because it requires less thinking. Someone asks the questions, we just answer them. So that's I'm all for that. So the first question off of Twitter is essentially, with all of the recruiting classes that Penn State has coming in, how long does it take until you see an impact on the field? And that's sort of an interesting thing, and I think really what sort of defines how fast James Franklin can get the program on its, hypothetical 2 feet and be able to move forward. And I think you see guys like Barkley, you see the John Reeds, you see the Polks out there making an impact around the field, and you go, well, clearly there's talent here, and clearly it's young, and clearly it's coming in. But when you think about how many freshmen got green lighted to play this year, there was only 4 of them out of a very large class. And that means a lot of guys, it just takes time to get their bodies ready. It takes time for them to have a spot on the field to contribute. It just takes time to get a recruiting class and get it onto the field. If you figure that an offensive lineman, they want a guy to redshirt, then they want him to watch from the sidelines essentially, and then right around his redshirt junior or sophomore year, they want him to finally start to get those reps. So you figure that's a 3-year time frame just to get an offensive lineman, and that's maybe the toughest spot to get on the field as a young player. But I think it goes to show that it takes time to get talent from bringing it into town and getting it onto the field. So how long does it take? I think it's clear that it's already impacting. But in terms of when does the Franklin, so-called revolution really take hold in the sort of team that you see, I think that's probably still a year or two down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much else to say. There are players that it's going to take a couple of years for them to be 100% ready to make a huge impact. There are guys like Barkley who can come in and within their first 3 games, they have a game against a solid opponent where they scored 14 points and rushed for 200 yards. And you have Reed who picked off a ball on Saturday. So you already see some of Franklin's guys in his second year making an impact on the field. But until, there's still 4 or 5 Joe Paterno players on this team. So it's going to take some time. It'll probably be another 2-3 years until it's fully a James Franklin team. But this year already we're seeing an impact from his recruiting classes. But it's also important to note that just because you have very highly rated recruiting classes, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a top 10 team in the country 2 years from now necessarily. But I think that answers the question.
We've got that base covered nice and good. The next question is, based on what we know right now and what we've seen, what is a new prediction for Penn State's record/bowl game? Admittedly, I don't commit Big Ten bowl tie-ins to memory, so I'm not going to say, the Outback Bowl, because that's going to be where Penn State finishes in the standings. But I do think Penn State still has a shot for a January bowl. I think they still have an opportunity to have a good season. It really just comes down to how much progress can they make week to week. I think From the flip side, you look at where do the losses sit on this schedule. I think Penn State can lose to Northwestern because I think Northwestern is a good team and probably better still than people think. I think that game at a neutral site against Maryland can pose some problems, even if Maryland is not as good as they were last year. I think that game is the equivalent of Rutgers all over again, but it's in a different place. It's in a less friendly confines than Beaver Stadium. I think, obviously Ohio State and Michigan State and even Michigan, even though Michigan has not necessarily, Jim Harbaugh has not turned that program around overnight, as everyone, no one expected him to do that, but it certainly hasn't happened. That's still a game that can be a difficult win. So there's 4 or 5 losses that are sitting on that schedule in theory. Can Penn State pick up a win here or there? In some of those losses, I think that's certainly possible. You can beat Northwestern, you can beat Maryland, and they can probably beat Michigan. It's going to take a different team than the one we've seen for them to knock off Ohio State or Michigan State. So that's still an 8 or 9. I think it's anywhere between 7 and 9 wins. If I'm doing the math off the top of my head correctly, that's sort of like a best case, worst case right now. But then again, like we've seen the talent. It's just a matter of getting it all on the same page. And the last one, which will get something from you, so I don't answer all the questions. What does last weekend's game do for the recruiting trail in terms of, regardless of the winning or losing, just sort of like the atmosphere and everything? Does that make an impact in your mind more so or less so than just winning the game?
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, you had a game 2 weeks ago against Temple that really hurts your recruiting efforts, especially when you're playing a Philadelphia team, and that's an area that we try and recruit heavily in, and you see Penn State essentially get their butts kicked against a Philly-based team. But then you have this Rutgers game where it's a stripe out, the stadium looks incredible, it's nighttime, there are fireworks, you have, I don't know what they called the attendance at, but it looked to me like 100 and 105. Okay.
103 and change.
So you have six figures in terms of a crowd there. So do I think that all helps more than what actually happened on the field? No, but it certainly plays a big role in it. It's about as good of an atmosphere as you're going to get in college football, and that's coming from someone who's been to Ohio State, who's been to the Big House in Michigan. I've been to some of the bigger stadiums in the country, and Beaver Stadium's about as good as it can get. So, yes, it helps. Does it help more than the product on the field in a 28-3 victory over a conference rival, dare I say? No, it doesn't help more than that. But certainly the atmosphere plays a role in recruiting.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think, when you trot out kids, Jason Kimbinda, again, said after the game, he met Troy Reeder at the Michigan Whiteout a couple of years ago, and it was the sort of atmosphere that made him go, like, I liked what Syracuse had to offer, but I have to come to Penn State. And I think when you put a bunch of kids out on a field in front of a crowd like that, they go, this could be me, and it's hard to say no to that, and it certainly makes sense. I think certainly winning on the field helps. I think sometimes that gets overvalued, especially in a big game where you play Ohio State and maybe you lose, and people go, oh, well, now the recruits aren't going to come to Penn State anymore. And I think ultimately it's about the experience that they have. I think everyone understands that the team they'll play for is different than the team that's on the field, and as long as you're not trotting them out for thumpings every week, for the most part, things are going to be okay. But any recruits that come to town this week, Odyssey of Penn State win, taking on San Diego State at 3:30 at Beaver Stadium. Hopefully it won't be raining. I'll be inside either way, but I'd like to walk from my car to the press box in the sun and not the rain. So for Zach Berger, I'm Ben Jones, and we will see you guys next week.